Welcome to today's Tamarack Institute webinar titled Investing in Place-Based Change, Practice and Innovation with Emily Sun, Jill Blundell, Lela Kogbara, Draimin and Sylvia Cheuy. My name is Jaime Stief. I work with the Tamarack Institute and I'll be here to help with tech over the course of today's conversation. Before we begin, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you all from the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. And with that, I am going to hand the mic over to my esteemed colleague, Sylvia Cheuy, who is the Tamarack Institute's Consulting Director for Collective Impact.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see so many people on the call. I am very excited to welcome our guests to today's webinar. So let me introduce our speakers. Starting at the bottom of my screen anyway. Why don't I follow the visual? That might be a little easier. Starting with Emily. Emily Sun is the co-founder and co-lead of Place Matters UK. She comes to this role having served previously as an HR director for Eli Lilly in the UK, and then shifted her work with organizations in the social health and education sectors. She's really interested in building cultures, leadership, and teams where collaborative learning and innovation flourish. She now works with people and organizations focused on community-centered, multi-stakeholder approaches, enabling place to regenerate and thrive. And she's also a board member on several charities in education and employment. Next, Joe Blundell brings to this work a background in public service. She began her career with the National Health Service in the UK, working in consulting and in public service delivery organizations. She's trained as a service designer and is a design expert with the UK Design Council. And in the past 10 years, she's focused on enabling multi-agency collaboration as executive director of the Government Outcomes Lab at the Blundell School of Government, an associate with Collaborative CIC, an owner of Future Public, and now at Place Matters. And while she was at the Blundell School of Government, she led the research into Are We Rallying Together, which really explored how local government collaborates with communities for change. And she now joins Emily as the co-lead at Place Matters. And next we have Lela Kogbara, who is the director of Black Thrive Global and was a senior leader in the public sector for 25 years, 16 of which were in Islington, where she was the assistant chief executive for the council. She's worked with the National Health Service in England and the Department of Education to improve employment prospects and access to apprenticeships for people with learning and other disabilities, and she's a qualified accountant. Her responsibilities have included policy, equalities, performance, arts and culture, employment, and community safety. And she also follows her passion for social justice as a board member of many organizations. And last but certainly not least, Draimin, a senior fellow with the Community Foundations of Canada, a board member of Trico Charitable Foundation, Social Innovation Canada, and Green Economy Canada. Tim is a futurist, a networker, and a capacity builder. And recently he authored Getting Started on Designing a Philanthropy Innovation Ecosystem Agenda, which was published in April of 2023, issue of Philanthropy Europe Association. So, wow, what a great panel. Let's maybe open up our dialogue. Can I hand the baton to you, Emily? Maybe you can pick up and tell us a bit more about the Place Matters UK.
Sure, very happy to, and great to be here as well. I'll just share a little bit more about Place Matters. We're actually a partnership organization of about 5 different organizations with a lot of experience in place-based work. And we use kind of place-based work interchangeably with, I suppose, sort of more collective impact types of approaches, very much led by communities, but with cross-sector collaboration. And we're all about sort of how do we share the incredible learning and experiences and knowledge around this work. It's very difficult to do, it's very contextualized, much more efficiently. And also how through that learning can we enable greater collaborations to happen between communities, funders, governments, employers, and all the other sectors that are really involved in this work. You asked, Sylvia, why community scale is so important. I mean, essentially, we think this is the most important level where communities are living day in and day out, working and deciding for themselves what kinds of communities they want to build and how to bring that about. But we also think it's really important for communities to work at other levels as well that impact the communities, such as regional, national levels, policy and funding, and ways of working that really have a huge impact on place.
So that's fantastic. If I can maybe move to Lela, tell us more about Black Thrive Global. And I know you're also working at the community level across the UK. So what are some of the lessons that you're learning about place-based work? How is that influencing how you think and work at Black Thrive Global?
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Happy to be here, and good to meet everyone. Yeah, so Black Thrive Global, we an organisation that we started off in one locality, and then in 2020 we expanded to cover a few localities in depth and then more nationally. And our aim is to address the issues and the systemic issues that impact the mental health and well-being of Black people and people of Black, African and Caribbean heritage. So that's what we exist to do, and we do that in terms of mainly through thinking about research and system change. So both quite large objectives, just two very large ones. And in terms of what lessons we've learned, what I would say is that the first lesson is obvious perhaps, but that no place is the same. And so and if you're dealing with race equity specifically, then what you find is that the racial composition of every locality is different. The history of every place is different. There are places where the slave ships might have landed. They have a very different experience from places which some of the inner cities where people have moved to in later times and so on. So you've got different histories and so on going on. But everybody has every place has got strengths and weaknesses. People have got different positioning in terms of the politicians, in terms of regional and local government and what they're trying to do. So you've got a very different collection of things going on. And so that's something that we've learned. It's obvious, but when you actually start working, it becomes even more obvious and practically an issue. So some of the things we've tried to do is to seek to understand and to learn and to collaborate with organizations that are known in communities already. So trying to find what are the local community actors that are interested in the same agenda as us. And out of that has come our concept of what we call knowledge construction and dissemination as a communal process. So that it's a kind of, there's a dance between knowing, learning, finding out, knowing, etc. The other thing that has, as a result of that we've tried to change is to think about strategies and tools and frameworks that we use in a different way to adapt to different contexts. So we, try to adopt experimental approaches and as a way of understanding and finding out and responding. And then the other thing that we've learned is that we need to think about flattening hierarchies and thinking about power in different ways and asymmetry of power in different ways. So, because actually, one of the things we've started to find is that people will tend to treat us as in some way superior to the other smaller Black organizations that might have been working in their area for decades. So we're learning to just avoid some of those traps. So those are just a few of the things I think we've learned over the years.
Thank you. This is going to be such a rich conversation. This paradox of working very locally and yet at the systems level is another thing that's kind of tweaked my interest. Okay, so My next question is for you folks at Place Matters, and maybe Joe, you can lead us off. You recently convened a number of different funders to discuss the investing in place. As part of this, Place Matters UK developed a backgrounder, I understand. Can you tell us a little bit more about the place and how did it then in turn seed the conversation with funders? Also want to know what happened, right?
Right. So yeah, it was very exciting. So I mean, the conversation, just to give a bit of background, and Emily, we can two-hand on this one, but the so we've been sort of building up over, gosh, 18 months or so of work, looking at the conditions that enable place-based change, more generally. And that's part of our purpose, really, is to work out kind of what's going to make this work accelerate, what's going to, help us all have more impact, what's going to help convince government to do more of this work, et cetera, et cetera. And what's emerged quite strongly in those discussions is that the way in which we fund this work, for all sorts of perspectives, the longevity of the funding, the fact that often funding is fragmented in different places. Lots of different funders generally go into, I don't know if this is the same outside the UK, but what we find is funders will go into places that they perceive to be the greatest need. So that's often the same sorts of places, and they'll work in quite a disjointed way often. And that we find that absorbs really the energy of a lot of the community organizations that are trying to do this work, the capacity they have to face off to all of these different funding streams. And as importantly, the work that we are principally involved in and interested in is the kind of the more systemic, wicked, if you like, issues, the things that have been blighting communities often for generations, that don't, whatever sort of pots of funding or programs come in, doesn't seem, the dial on those particular issues doesn't seem to shift, and certainly in any sustainable way. So, and all of which leads to the need for, if you like, big radical collaboration. You can't do systemic work without connecting the system, the whole system that surrounds the kind of challenge in a deep way. And I know that's no news to anybody on this call, because we all talk, don't we, about partnership, collaboration, and relationships, and blah 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 blah. But critically, it means establishing it means thinking about the capacity and the place to work in this way. So we got some funders together. We've got 16 funders in a room, in a round table, and we did some pre-work with them to say what's the issues that you're seeing as you fund place-based work, and where's the opportunity for change. And really the two things that are emerging, three things that are emerging, which we think are exciting. One is a very tactical thing, but I'll start with that, is that we're just going to start with mapping who does what. Now that's incredibly simple, but building the picture of who is funding what. We're in that work, we're including philanthropy, and we're going to include government. We've got government as a partner in this, which makes it even more interesting. That we can try to get a sense of where people are tackling similar things, where they're perhaps tackling things in a different way, where government funding is or isn't, and also where the hot spots are and where the cold spots are, if you like. Because I think we're also seeing that people fund where there is capacity sometimes. They fund where people apply for the money, where they've got the capacity to put the applications in for bids, and often communities that have the least capacity and don't have the kind of, they don't have the cohesiveness or the skills to put together applications for grants, get left out. So we need to understand that picture, and that's kind of what the mapping is going to show up. And then what it's going to hopefully inform is where the opportunities for collaboration are. Now that might be something as simple as we're all working on similar things in a similar-ish geography. We must speak to each other in a different way. We must collaborate in order to use this precious community resources, community assets in the most effective way, is one. We have a sort of broader ambition, which is around building a sort of field catalyst approach, which hopefully is meaningful to some people on this call, which we're very much sort of being informed by the work in North America around sort of building field catalysts, and Tamarack actually in particular around your work around tackling poverty, is that we think it's time for a kind of a collective North Star a collective mission where we all sort of, where you know, however communities might react and respond very differently in terms of how they choose to act on a particular issue, they share a broader mission and intent, which allows them to be influence the big sort of systems actors, national government, regional government, etc., and speak with a voice. So we're exploring all of those options, and it's all on the table. So we feel like we're on a very exciting, radical journey to sort of start with funders thinking about how they might stitch together, you know, their current work and their future work.
Lovely. Anything you would add to that, Emily, from kind of speaking about that work?
Sure. No, I don't want to hog up too much time from the other panelists, but one thing I just wanted to share was a slide, if Jaime could help show that, which is taking off of Joe's comments about funders looking to have greater impact and thinking about impact at a systems level rather than just a programmatic level or organizational level. One of the things that we were struck by is that funders are really rethinking what their role is and could be. Beyond the collaboration that Joe mentioned, it's also about their own role, you know, and you could sort of, on this continuum, which we just sort of put together based on everyone's thinking and what we've heard, is that sort of traditionally funders may have been at the more organizational level where they were sort of starting to fund programs and then thinking about core funding, and then they evolved into capacity building support for the organization level funding and support they were providing. We then see that quite a number of funders have already moved into the sort of funding at the place or network level. So we've talked to funders who are saying it's not enough to fund one or two programs or organizations in a place. We'd like to fund several to really help build up the whole sector. Or it might not be a geographic place. It could be a sector working on the same kind of themes across different geographies. But again, here, we saw that over the years, funders were starting to move from funding, but then starting to convene different organizations within a sector or a place to say, how can we really help provide some of that infrastructure to help organizations come together and work differently across place. And then at the final sort of end of the spectrum, we're not saying that all funders should be here, and some funders may be at different parts of this continuum at the same time. But clearly, what we're seeing, that what we saw in North America, perhaps more examples that are articulated better, we're trying to sort of articulate and help foster and enable here, we as a very collective we, which is how can funders get more involved in the research, policy influence, sharing of learning, and building more explicit collaborations, not just amongst the programs and initiatives, but amongst funders, commissioners, policymakers, investors. So, and what we saw that was very exciting is funders really thinking about the much broader ecosystem of actors that need to come together to make change happen at all levels, place, regional, and national. So I'm going to leave it there. We've hogged a lot of time, but give it back to you, Sylvia.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Emily. So Tim, this just feels like the perfect time to draw you into the conversation. You, throughout your career, now bring this really broad perspective of the philanthropy ecosystem in Canada and globally. And I know that you recently convened a study tour with several folks from Canada over to the UK. Tell me a little bit more about what that study tour was about and some of the highlights and insights that you brought home.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks everybody. It's wonderful to be with you, and on such a interesting panel with so many people from so many different places. Yeah. So I think I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. Basically, as you mentioned, Sylvia, I was involved in an experiment really. Coming out of COVID and the lockdown and people being isolated, there was a sense that it would be really valuable if we could find a way to knit the interests of diverse organizations to come together to learn in a different way. And we thought that one interesting way to do that would be to pick a very specific ecosystem. We chose London, UK, which has so many really interesting characteristics to it, to be able to illustrate pioneering work and social innovation, social finance, social enterprise, and the future of philanthropy. It touched on many of the themes that we've already talked about here, but our focus wasn't specifically on place-based, but obviously the richness of an ecosystem that's very innovative like London really came up. I mean, as we know, like innovation ecosystems depend on people, depend on ideas, and depend on capital. And London is a really interesting place where all those things come together with different types of institutions contributing to them. We also wanted to kind of have diversity in who was going to be on this tour. And so it was made up of one philanthropic association, the Community Foundations of Canada. It was also the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, a UK organization, the Royal Society of the Arts, which some people might be aware of. It's interested in coming to Canada, and Social Innovation Canada. Two of those organizations, Social Innovation Canada and the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, are relatively young, about 4 or 5 years old. So in a sense, I think this became a bit of an interesting experiment of what could be ways in which they could be learning about their own kind of network and institution building strategies. We covered all of Canada from British Columbia to Nova Scotia. And about a quarter of the participants came from philanthropy. We had somebody from government, from business, from impact investing, a lot from the social sector, the social enterprise sector, from academia. And I guess we were really fortunate that we had a week of basically inviting some leading organizations across the 4 themes that I mentioned. And I'm just going to pick just several takeaways. There were a lot of people on the tour, including Danya, who was there from Tamarack. But the first one for me was, if we're thinking about learning going into the future, I'd like to forgive the pattern I used to have as a grant maker of going away on study tours with other philanthropists. I think this was a much, much better experience, bringing together activists who are working at the local community level together with philanthropists, because everybody grows through the diversity of perspectives that people bring to those discussions as a result. That was really important. The second one for me was that although in Canada, we're talking a lot about systems change, a lot about how do we be more proactive in thinking about the future, my takeaway from London was that conversation has been kicked much further forward and is much more visible. Like I take as one example, next week, the JRF, the Roundtree Foundation, is hosting a big philanthropy discussion on the future of philanthropy and investment for social change and systems change. We just don't have that kind of conversation happening in the same degree. The second part of that for me was the folks that we met with are thinking much bigger thoughts. We are often thinking about just our local community or our local organization, and they're really kind of asking the question, well, these systems that appear at the local level are being conditioned by the bigger public policy questions. We have to be engaged in those things, and we have to be thinking about how we can influence them. And my third takeaway was that I felt that there was a really rich conversation that was kind of connecting the dots between things that a lot of us have talked about for several decades around social capital. How do we create social capital? And that really appears at the community level. And people in the UK are talking about social capital. They're talking about how that leads to creating a richer, more dynamic social fabric at a community level. And then they've had this third level of the conversation, which is around social infrastructure. Now, we've had some of that conversation about social infrastructure, but again, it just hasn't reached the same level of relevance and visibility. And it's much more tactile. There's so much more resources that have been produced around it, and the conversations that have been held about it. So I think all those things for me kind of represent the opportunity for the inspiration by doing something like a learning tour, because I think all of us, and Tamarack as a Canadian leader, we're trying to build a kind of fit for the challenges we have type of learning system. And we have to be taking advantage of how do we build this more systematically into how we're doing all of our work.
I'm just so engrossed in the conversation at the moment. I think what's really striking me is, you know, the thoughtfulness around what are the questions we need to be asking? What are the conversations that need to be happening? How do we think and learn collectively to kind of confront the challenges that we know, the systemic ones that we know need to be tackled individually and then together? I'm curious, just following up from all the conversation, maybe starting with Joe, Emily, what do you see as the next steps in the UK for advancing place-based conversation? And I would add, Lela, you to that. Like, what are you seeing as possible in the UK? What would be your hope?
So I think that one of the big hopes we have in the UK, and it's all grass greener, isn't it, Tim? Because we sort of look to you in Canada all the time, thinking you feel like our big sister. But anyway, I think what we're seeing in the UK is we're a very highly centralized governed nation. And that means that traditionally policy and the power has been held very, very tightly in the central government. But what we're seeing now is an evolution of more devolution of power to regional governments. And I think if we've got a hope is that appetite for devolution, it allows us to make better sense of some of these more complex systems questions, because I think, you know, we're in this highly kind of interconnected and overly complicated world that we all kind of having to grapple with. Just trying to put that into smaller geographies, working at a community level in places, just enables us, I think, to make more sense and to grapple with some of that complexity in a better way. So our hope is that progressive devolution will be, you know, what we'll see in the UK and beyond. You of course have provincial governments already, so you're way ahead. We have we don't really have that to the same extent. I think the other thing is, I think we want to be better at learning in the UK. So we need to have the infrastructure to learn better and to treat place-based work as a practice, which we believe it is. It has so many unique characteristics, so many unique demands on the skills of the people doing it and the ways of working, in the ethos of working, the culture, as well as the skills that go with it, that recognizing and honoring that and investing in it crucially, so it becomes something that people go on to sort of develop their skills and stay in it as a practice would be our certainly my dream. But I'll let Emily and Lela say more.
Who's next? Yeah, Emily, tell us, what would you add?
So absolutely around devolution and the changes in politics and power, and the need to ensure that leads to more equity and leads to much more social justice than we have today. And I think the other thing I would add is I think we're living at a time where our indicators of inequality and poverty are going in the wrong direction. And this is the UK. We should not be in that situation. We should be, we should have really, Canada's sort of ambition to have poverty over 15 years. We would like to see that place-based work doesn't just stay at the community level, but that we have actors within the system at the regional level, at the national level, working much more horizontally and vertically across these levels for greater impact, greater scale, and much more speed than we've seen. So it is a radical kind of collaboration that we need going forward.
Wonderful. Lela, what's coming up for you?
What I would add to what Emily and Joe have said in terms of hopes is I would say that one of the issues for us at Black Thrive is noticing this issue of our community, Black communities, and others. There are other, groups of people within the UK whose outcomes are really, really poor and have been for decades and haven't shifted. So even when the trajectory has been up, it's not worked for everyone. So one of the things I think would be a hope would be this idea of data democracy, so that actually communities, we try to understand things in a different way across places and in comparison to places, and that we engage communities in sense making to even decide what it is What data should we collect? Because clearly the evidence-based approach is working for some groups, but not for everybody. So I would say that the idea of seeing the places and the connection between places from the perspective of the community, but really having the communities knowing integrated into our data and evidence and our learning. So even what we've said about, so for example, funders and where they are, even just knowing, a lot of people don't know who's funding what, where, etc. And so there's a lot of data that, if it was visible and clear, not to us who are working in the system, to governments and to communities, that for me would be a powerful driver for change and improvement.
Lovely. Tim, what would you add as a hope?
Well, I guess for me is the one I just ended on before, that our learning systems are a bit haphazard. I worry that we face huge resource constraints. I see a lot of duplication of people doing the same kinds of things again and again. And so I'm really concerned that we find better ways to be learning what colleagues are doing in other jurisdictions, and that we find ways to kind of draw from those and grab some insights, and then find ways to change our own behaviors in positive ways as a result of what we're learning. I realize we need to keep it light. We can't sustain a lot of infrastructure around how we do these things. But I don't think we're taking advantage of the technology we have to be able to do that.
Beautiful. I know we want to protect some time for questions. What I've really taken away is the power of learning from each other, learning across the globe, learning through diversity, even learning what each other is doing, as you illustrated so beautifully, Lela. You know, that paradox of absolutely investing and learning from local innovation, and also using that to connect and mobilize for systems level impact and change. And the value of capital, both relational capital, but also, looking at what is the financial capital needed, and are we aligning that with the challenges in front of us individually and collectively. So that's beautiful. I know we can keep this conversation going, but I'm really keen to bring in some of the thoughts, ideas, and questions from our participants. Jamie, what are we seeing in our Q&A box?
So we see a question from Emmanuel, who mentions we've had a few communities, including Newcomer, that have a different sense of place-based. Can we start to imagine a spectrum of possibilities?
Ooh, what a juicy question. I love this. Folks, what do you see as the spectrum of possibilities that would be encompassed in a place-based approach?
And Emmanuel has mentioned that they're joining us from the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, which is a real powerhouse in Canada as far as Black community advancement, obviously.
Any of you, what's bubbling?
I'll chip in. I don't totally understand the question, but what I would say is, I'm not sure whether I've understood the question, but I felt it. And what I felt, because I come to the UK, I came to the UK as a refugee when I was a child. So that question of what is place and what does it mean, for me, immediately that question came up. It was like, oh, I can feel that, because it's not a question, it's not an easy answer for me to give. So what I would say is, in terms of, I think often for migrants, particularly, or refugees, places is more than one thing. So where I am, I would describe myself as often belonging everywhere and belonging nowhere. So, and that has implications for where I see myself. But I'm where I am when I'm here. And I guess when we think about a spectrum, I do see myself as a bit of a global citizen. And I relate to originally coming as a Biafran. I wasn't, we're now Nigerians, but we weren't at the time because it was a civil war. But I see myself in no sense. So the idea that actually place doesn't have to be a fixed thing, I definitely feel, but there's something about you invest in where you live, for example, and that's a place, but that you have relationships with other places globally, not just within one place, where your people are from, or where you're, in my case, where my people were sent to in the Caribbean or in America or Canada or wherever. So the place is I think for some communities certainly complex. I don't know if that answers that particular question, but that's what came to my mind when I saw it.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think that was really helpful for me, at least, about differentiating how we talk about community. Joe, Emily, Tim, anything you'd chime in around that?
I think just to add, it's one of the biggest challenges to do this work well. And we're just about to publish just a little mini plug with Tamarack and others. Actually, our nascent global community with Collaboration for Impact and Inspiring Communities in Australasia, that we are together, we've kind of pulled together a view of what equity means, which has been a bit of a learning, I have to say, for me and actually for us in terms of our practice in the UK, because I think whilst we would always try and work with equity, we are less sophisticated, I think, than other places in their thinking. So what we've learned is the kind of, and I think it probably speaks to Emmanuel's point, that you end up with, in many communities, particularly communities that we work with that have issues of social justice, are also often very complex communities in terms of their heritage and their background and where people come from. So to work well in place-based work, it's acknowledging and working with those communities and studying the differences, but building the cohesion, building the sense of the togetherness, and working with communities equally. Now that that is complex, because part of working with equity is shifting the kind of dominant ways of working, the dominant white ways of working that in our culture define the way, we have meetings, we have formal meetings, etc., don't we? And we have ways of behaving in meetings that don't always invite in people from other cultures. So finding that space where people can both, feel welcomed in and included in, when you've got communities with lots of us and people that are newly in country, perhaps newcomers to that point, that have still got to, still got to kind of learn the vernacular of the country that they've just moved to, and also bringing those communities together into a space that feels inclusive for all, I think is a real genuine challenge to do it well. So I don't have the answers, but I think we're very aware of that in thinking about how we do that well.
Emily, Tim, anything you would chime in around with respect to the question? I think one of the things I've certainly appreciated is, Lela, your advice around you have to anchor in a geographic place, even if you have relationship or your identity is tied to multiple places, because I think it makes it really practical, right? It keeps it out of a theoretical, and it pushes us to experiment and be tangible, which is something that I really value. All right, our next question, Jaime, is
from an anonymous attendee. They ask, if you were an organization responsible for building the skills of provincial healthcare organizations to collaborate with communities, where would you start? So I'm hearing an angle of public health. I'm thinking about, skills building, and taking a local lens to how we might enable that. Any thoughts?
really
I'm happy to start the conversation. It's a great question, and I think it's a really big one. And although our healthcare systems are very different in the UK, we have recently moved to a different healthcare structure where the health boards in each region are actually much more responsible for working directly with and in communities. So that's a big shift for our national healthcare system. And to be honest, I think everyone's finding that very difficult of a shift, because many in the healthcare system are not used to working so directly with community members, and vice versa as well. So we, in the kind of work that we do in facilitating learning across community groups and community collaborations, one of the things that they have been scratching their heads on is, how do we build relationships with health better? How do we bring them into the collaboration tables? And there's an accessibility question. I think that we've found that people in the healthcare system are incredibly stretched. They say that they've got plenty for their day jobs. They're finding the capacity to work with community and cross collaborations is really difficult. So one is enable people who are doing this type of work in healthcare systems to have the capacity and the headroom and the headspace to do this, rather than as the sort of 10th thing after their day is done. So one is capacity. The second really is, my instinct sort of takes me to just to be able to listen to what is happening across the community and the diversity of the community. I think in healthcare systems, there's such a pressure to perform and to deliver, and such a pressure to tick boxes and targets. And it's very pressurized, I can imagine, in pretty much any healthcare system. So how to balance that tension of the pressure to deliver every day with the need to build relationships and really understand what's happening in a diverse community is a real challenge of culture, capacity, as well as capability. So just, as a management person in the healthcare systems, to really enable the headspace and the slight shift in culture, as well as capability, I think is really important. But I would say, let's start with the basics of just spending the time to get to know what's happening, rather than needing the pressure to deliver, within a month.
Beautiful.
My very long 2 cents worth.
Tim, anything you would add?
I think those are really, great suggestions around the capacity building and the listening. Yet really, a lot of what we're talking about is how are we helping to promote a cultural change and a mindset change. And so I think that we all know that there are all these intangibles that lie as barriers below the surface. So I think we need to find more creative ways of surfacing these things and making them visible, and actually then getting them on the to-do, the action agenda on the part of people, of thinking through what are the strategies that they can apply. And maybe sometimes we just have to be really, really creative about how we help to influence that agenda. And one suggestion I would just share from a kind of work that we've been doing, we have a program on the transformation of philanthropy at Community Foundations of Canada. And actually one of the vectors that I don't think was anticipated would be so influential has been created a small cohort of transformation storytellers. Young people who get short-term paid internships, and just really supporting them to be as creative as they like, to take a lot of the themes that we've been working with and create devices for sharing with the broader community. And I would say that their creativity has probably outstripped anything that people were anticipating. Just involving those young people in doing this has been really revelatory.
Anything you could share, any links that we benefit from the wisdom of those transformation storytellers would be fantastic. Lela, as I'm listening to this question, I couldn't help but be drawn back to your comments about the democracy of data, for sure. But anything else that comes to mind for you about this?
I think that I was going to say data, but because one of the things I don't know, I sound geeky, but one of the things that I found is that democratizing data is a game changer. That people relate to each other differently. They see a different picture and so on. So that for me, one of the skills that is needed is to actually, and data doesn't just mean numbers. Obviously it includes numbers, but it includes a lot of other things. So for me, I would say that working to understand together, sense making together, using the data you've got to work with local communities for them to shed light. And certainly we found from the work we've done at Black Thrive that there are questions that are not even being asked. So one of the issues, for example, in the UK is that Black women are, 4+ times more likely to die in childbirth, for example, or in prenatal and postnatal and childbirth. And it's not been, nobody knows why particularly, but that there are women, Black women, who this is thing that is exercising them. And to work with those communities and to build skills, what happens is that we, or those of us who might think, oh yeah, we're experts at this or the other, that the actual community knowledge and the feeling of what occurs, and a lot of what occurs is in a space, the data is not the kind of data the system collects. Okay, so they talk about who they trust to say what, why they decided not to take certain advice, why they withdrew from this and so on. That's all data, which once you start engaging in a different way. So I think building up the skill to think about things together, for me, would be a critical part of changing health outcomes.
Beautiful. I'm mindful of time. We have one last question, if we could. Rachel asks, when working in or with institutions, so that could be schools, government, large nonprofits, how do we start to shift their narrative of what it means to do place-based work, especially when there are such power dynamics at play? Great question. The first thing that comes to mind for me is, this notion of a focus group, right? So, these institutions feeling like they go out and their job is to come up with the solution, which they then in turn try to sell to community. And that helps them because they only have to cope with one solution, right? And it's a real narrative and cultural shift to go out with the questions. And it's more vulnerable, frankly. So that's one thing that comes to mind around that willingness to recognize that there are different approaches. But I'm more interested, Joe, Emily, Lela, Tim.
Yeah, I've to chip in. I mean, I think some of the great examples that we've seen of where that some of those barriers have shifted. So there's UK colleagues will probably know this one, but there's a place called Wigan in the UK, which is north of Manchester in the northwest, and they had a really inspirational chief exec who took a different philosophy of what leadership of place meant. And she was in charge of both health and local government. She had oversight of both in her role, and she and her colleagues, to be honest, it was the politicians that led as well as the executives, just took the view that they didn't have the answers and they reached out. And so what they did is in terms of how they performed their jobs, they spent a much greater proportion of time out there listening and talking to communities and community organizations. And by doing that, they actually built the relationships and the trust with some of those community organizations and started to believe that they might have different answers to everyone. Everyone says, and this is sort of one of those truisms, you go out and ask the community what they think, they come up with the radical ideas you've never thought of, and they give you the insights you would never have got to. And actually, so by going through that experience and also seeing what capacity there was out there in the community, they started to then shift their money that is spent into community organizations. And of course, that has a catalytic effect. So once you start that and you bring the money down, and the community organization can start to build their capacity, they're more effective, and then you start to, and they're reaching into parts of the community you could never get to in an effective way because they're set up for different parts of your community. They're in places that that reach them in a different way, and they in the middle of financial austerity, where literally every local authority was in deep financial trouble, couldn't balance what, particularly around social care, the kind of care of the elderly, etc., in the community. They balanced the books, and they were the only one to do it. And they did it because they're one of the only ones to do it against the trend, massively against the trend. And they did it because the community organizations were much more effective, both cost effective and also effective in terms of impact. So it's a different style, I think. But it's immensely brave, because when you've got a target culture, letting go of power and putting it in the community to organizations that you actually can't, you know, you can't necessarily control in the same way. You have to believe. And so it's down to people with different belief systems, I think, and really, really believing that communities have assets. And I think a lot of people say it, but few people actually believe it.
Beautiful. And how to put it into action. You've illustrated beautifully. Tim, Emily, Lela, anything to chime in?
If there's a little bit of time, I'd love to just add to that, which I think the question also referred to sort of power dynamics and differentials. And there is something about sort of the community voice versus the infrastructure of corporations or, you know, health institutions or government institutions, and how can that be much more a level playing field so that real conversations and dialogues can happen. And that sort of inequality of the infrastructure and things available to community organizations versus what's available to big institutions. We see time and again, it's kind of like in collective impact, you kind of need a backbone structure in order to coordinate. And actually so much of what the backbone does, whatever the scale is to equalize power as well, is to create a space where smaller to medium-sized organizations, whether they be 2 staff or much bigger than that, can come together and join up to a much more collective voice with a third-party infrastructure that really helps create that dialogue without having to worry about the inequality of the power dynamics. And without that sort of equalizing infrastructure, it's very, very difficult to have these cross-sector collaborations, really. That's more than tokenistic and much more about real impact and real dialogue.
You know what's so terrible? I'm watching the clock and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, can you believe we have 1 minute left? And I just don't want to lose the opportunity to deeply thank each and every one of you. I could have kept this conversation going, I can see from the chat, many people would love to have seen, but really, really appreciate the wisdom, the perspectives. This is certainly a topic, a juicy topic that we need to continue to revisit, I suspect. We're just beginning to kind of feel our way through. So thank you all for sharing your wisdom, your time, and over to you, Jaime, maybe to wrap us up.
For sure. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be sending a copy of the recording and any resources shared in the chat in a follow-up email coming out in the next few days. I shared a link to Sylvia's next webinar happening on August 2nd, relating to 5 community-driven practices for systems change. And we'll be sending you a link to that in follow-up email. Thanks so much.